let's start with the ark and bark. One has a B, one does not. When we look at the ark of the Israelites and then the bark of the Egyptians, we see parallels between them. We see parallels between the Ark of the Covenant described by Levite priests. They are the only ones that describe it. The J text doesn't bother with it. So we see the parallels between the Ark of Covenant and then the ancient Egyptian barks. These barks, though designed as boats, were rarely placed in water. They rarely put them in water. Instead, they were carried in processions as sacred ritual objects. You would notice, if you do some research on it, that many of them, which are the barks, the Egyptian barks, many of them were adorned with gold plating. They were decorated with images of winged cherubs or birds, and they were carried on poles by priests. What were they? In essence, they served as both a throne and a footstool for the deity or for a deity. And it's been suggested that the Israelites adapted this model to form their own Ark of the Covenant. If you want a good source, read the Egyptian origin of the Ark of the Covenant by Scott B. Nogel. He says the bark served as a model which the Israelites adapted for their own needs. So the people in Egypt, those who were slaves in Egypt, the Shasu would have seen this, they would have known this. So when it came to the Ark of the Covenant, we do see that they may have taken the technology from Egypt. They may have known about it. They may have seen it. They may have seen the priests carrying it. And we see that the Ark of Covenant of the Israelite has many parallels to that of the Egyptian bark. Further telling you or supporting my claim that it's only these people who came out of Egypt. The Israelites in the land of Canaan would have access to this kind of information, to this detail. And you see the details of the Ark of the Covenant by the Levites in their writings. Any questions on that before I move on? So let's look at circumcision. When we look at circumcision, it was actually the texts, interestingly, it was the text authored by Levites that introduced the practice of circumcision, despite its existence in ancient Egypt. It was the Levite authors, when we look at the text. The J author is not concerned about that, but the Levite authors included the requirement of circumcision in the priestly covenant between God, the deity, and Abraham in Genesis, and in Leviticus's priestly law. This was from the hand of the Levites. It's also worth it to know that only Levite writers use the metaphor of circumcision of the heart, which can be found in Leviticus 24:41, and then Deuteronomy 10:16, and then 30 verses 6. It gets interesting because this metaphor also appears in the works of two prophets, Jeremiah and then Ezekiel. What do we know about these two prophets? Take a wild guess.
They were in Egypt.
Okay? Or even much better, they were Levite priests. So it's quite important. Those who use that language are all coming, even though we have two prophets there, they all have Levitical priestly backgrounds. Leviticus 26 tells us, "Then I too will treat them as happenstance and bring them back while in the land of their enemies. If then their uncircumcised heart," so Leviticus, the priestly narrative, they use this language, the circumcision of the heart. In Deuteronomy 10, we see the same thing. "You shall circumcise the foreskin of your heart." This is all coming from the hand of the Levite. We get to the prophet Jeremiah, and he uses the same language. "Circumcise yourself 2 and remove the foreskin of your heart." Ezekiel also uses the same language. By bringing aliens of uncircumcised heart and of uncircumcised flesh, verses 9, he uses uncircumcised heart again. But then we look at their background and we see Jeremiah tells us the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth. So we see his priestly background. Ezekiel also gives us that data. The word of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was revealed to Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, the priest. So he's coming from what? A priestly background. And it's interesting that all 11 of these references to circumcision can be traced back solely to Levite sources. The law of circumcision is not found in J. It's only found with the priests. These people who are coming out of Egypt. Why is that? We'll get there. Well, J, the non-Levite source, J, makes mention of circumcision in stories. It would mention circumcision, but it's in a story. It's not a commandment. And even when it does mention it in narrative, we would see that it's in reference to Levites. In J, circumcision is not present as a law or a requirement of the covenant, but rather as a known practice. One of the stories involves Moshe's Midianite wife, Zipporah, who performs this strange ritual at a lodging place when they were on their way to Egypt. That is the first narrative. The other story involves the use of circumcision as a strategy to disable and destroy some people. We're looking at the case of Dinah and Shechem in Genesis 34. Now, it's important to note that even in this source, only 2 out of Dinah's 12 brothers use this strategy. And the main one happens to be a Levite. It was Levi. He was the brain behind it. And then when you come to the second narrative of Moshe in connection with circumcision, Moshe is a Levite. And the son who was circumcised, or whatever ritual was his name, Zipporah did to Gershom, tracing his lineage, we see that in the book of Judges, he was also from an important Levitical clan. We see that in Judges 18. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, both he and his sons were priests in the tribe of Dan until the day of the exile of the land. So it is all coming to the Levites. Even when Jay mentions it, it's in connection to people who are Levites. The biblical text itself indicates that circumcision was also widespread in Egypt and the Levant. It wasn't anything unique. Jeremiah 9, let's read it. Behold, days are coming, says Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, when I will punish every circumcised one with his uncircumcision. I'll read it again. The deity is telling us that days are coming when he's going to punish people who are already circumcised with their uncircumcision. So physically they are circumcised, but they are not circumcised in the heart. And then the text lists these people who are circumcised: Egypt, Judah, Edom, the children of Ammon, the Moabites, and all those cast off to the corners who dwell in the desert. You're referring to the people in the south, where you find Midian, where you find Egypt, where you find Edom. They are circumcised. So being circumcised in the Levant, being circumcised in Israel as a Hebrew was not anything unique. It became unique. Initially, it wasn't. As in, when I say unique, meaning that you stood out. It made you special. No. The Egyptians were circumcised. Edom, circumcised. Ammon, circumcised. The Moabites, circumcised. And it says those who are cast to the corners, who dwell in the desert, the south. That's where you have all these people. They're circumcised. We do have Egyptian testimonies that suggest that circumcision was a rite of passage for adolescents, marking their entrance into adulthood. This was probably the case also in Israel and Judah. What changed? Well, when the Judeans were confronted with Babylonian civilization, Babylonian exile, where circumcision was not practiced, this custom, which had not previously been a distinctive ritual, suddenly took on an identity significance. Now you are at a place where the people don't perform this rite like most people did where you're coming from. So now the circumcision becomes a distinctive ritual. it separates you from the people who you are a slave or you're living in their land. And it was probably at this time that its meaning was changed and applied to newborns using the text of Genesis 17, where circumcision on the 8th day of a newborn's life was commanded by the deity to Abraham as a sign of the covenant he had made with the patriarch and his descendants. So you get to a place and you notice that the people are not circumcised and you are in, should I say, conflict with them. Okay, you're sitting by the rivers of Babylon and you're trying to figure out how to not assimilate into the people. So what do? Now, something that probably was done when somebody was older, like in Egypt, now it would make sense for you to make that distinction at birth. You see how it would change so that you can distinguish this Judean from that Babylonian. And then this practice now became a fundamental tradition in Judaism, comparable in importance to Christian baptism. So we do see where the circumcision may be coming from. The Levites who wrote about it, wrote so much about it, were the ones who may have experienced this in the south, in Egypt, in Edom, in Midian. That is why Zipporah knew what to do. That is why Zipporah knew when the deity that had been just introduced to Moshe comes to attack him, she knew what to do. And it's strange that she's doing something that later in the Hebrew tradition men will be required to do. Or how come a Midianite woman is the one performing such an act that Moshe refused to do or did not know how to do it or didn't realize that he had to do it? Whatever the case. Any questions on circumcision? Okay, so now we've seen the bark and the ark. Now we've seen circumcision in the south. We've seen it in Egypt. It's done, and how it may have evolved, and those who focus on it, are those who leave out of Egypt. The few that leave out of Egypt. Now let's look at Egyptian law. When you take the Exodus narrative, Exodus chapters 1 to chapters 15, you will notice that it consistently shows familiarity with Egyptian traditions. Now, the motives, the motive or the biblical motive of the hidden divine name, where Moshe asks Yah, what is your name? And he says, why do you ask my name? Sorry, no, why do you ask my name? He tells him, I'm, I'm, I'm mistaking Jacob with Moshe. No, so Moshe asks the name, and the name is hidden, and then the name is revealed to Moshe. We have it has familiarities with Egyptian traditions. The turning of inanimate objects into a reptile. We see that in Egyptian traditions. the conversion of water to blood is seen in Egyptian traditions. A spell of 3 days of darkness is seen in Egyptian traditions. The death of the firstborn, we see that in Egyptian tradition, Egyptian law. The parting of waters, where the water parts, the Israelites walk in, or the Hebrews walk in, we see that in Egyptian traditions. Now, the death by drowning, we see that in Egyptian traditions as well. What I've listed here, they cannot be found anywhere else but in Egypt in their traditions. So Exodus chapters 1 through chapters 15 evokes an Egyptian setting at every turn. If you can get this book, Moses the Magician, I can actually send you a YouTube video to actually watch, to see the man actually discuss this. The person writing it knows about this tradition from Egypt. Now, that's not even what makes it more revealing. But what makes it more revealing is that every one of them is from the Levite sources of E and P. The story of the Exodus from Egypt did not emerge out of nowhere. Its authors were familiar with Egyptian culture, traditions, and literature. But it was not known or important to all of the authors. It wasn't all the authors that were knowledgeable about Egyptian culture. It was only the Levite authors who had such knowledge. Only the sources from the Levites, EPD, tell the full story of the plagues on Egypt leading up to the people's exodus. The source J, the version that was not written by a Levite, does not include the plagues at all. But in the Levite sources, the 10 plagues are described. The turning of the river into blood, frog infestation, lice, insect swarm, livestock epidemic, boils, hail, locusts, I think 3-day darkness, and finally the death of the firstborn humans and animals. It's the Levite sources that give us all these details. It's the same source that gives us the competition with Egyptian sorcerers who try and fail to reproduce the plagues, as well as Pharaoh's hardened heart that keeps the plagues coming. It's all coming from the Levites. And then finally, the Levitical source describes Egypt's submission and the people's departure in extensive detail. It gives us 9 chapters of it. J contains none of this information. When you read J, it jumps from Moshe saying, "Let my people go," to the people already having departed Egypt. J is not bothered with that because J doesn't have that information. The Pharaoh is only mentioned briefly as well, when he refuses to let the Israelites leave, and he's not mentioned again until hearing that the people had fled. So J is very economical because J is not a Levite. J doesn't have the information, the data. He doesn't really care about it because he's never been there. But those who have been there, the Levites, they pay very close attention and then they document it. Where are they getting some of this from? Let's look at the Westcar Papyrus. We have a few stories in this papyrus, however you pronounce it. Let's read two of them. The king Sneferu is bored and seeks the advice of his chief lector. The lector recommended that the king gather 22, is it 22? No, gather 20 young women to sail him around the palace lake. Sneferu proceeds to order 20 beautiful oars and provides the women with nets to drape around them as they sail. Unfortunately, one of the women loses a precious amulet, a fish pendant made from malachites, whatever that is. The woman refuses to accept a substitute from the royal treasury, and until the amulet is returned to her, she and the other women refuse to row. The king is distressed by this turn of events, but the chief lector comes to the rescue. He skillfully folds aside the water to locate and retrieve the amulet before folding the water back into place. Does that sound familiar? So the amulet falls into the water, probably the Nile, and the lady refuses a replacement. She wants that same one. And what does the chief lector do? He parts the sea, retrieves the amulet, probably stretches his hands, and the waters come back. This is a folklore, a tradition in Egypt. We have another one here. King Nebka, his chief lector, discovers that his wife is having an affair with a townsman from Memphis. To seek revenge, he creates a crocodile out of wax and casts a spell for it to come to life upon contact with water. Now, he throws the wax crocodile in the stream where the townsman enters the estate. As the townsman and the crocodile meet, the crocodile takes him to the bottom of the lake, where they remain for 7 days, while the lector entertains the visiting pharaoh. When Ubane shares the story with King Nebka, he calls the crocodile from the water and orders it to devour the townsman once and for all. Furthermore, the unfaithful wife is brought forth, set on fire, and thrown into the river as punishment. Does the crocodile remind you of anything? So the man, makes a crocodile out of wax. He cast his spells and it became alive. What does that remind you of? Mr. Yaziyahu says the staff. What did Aaron's staff turn into? It's a trick question. Not Moshe's staff. Aaron's staff. What did it turn into?
Didn't it bud with flowers?
Oh, yeah, it did, actually. But what did it turn into? Usually we would say a serpent, but no, not a serpent. Correct. In the chat, it turned into a crocodile. Moshe's rod at the burning bush turns into a serpent. But in front of Pharaoh, the rod is turned into a crocodile. And if you remember, I told you, why were they not, according to the narrative, why were the Pharaoh's magicians not moved? It's old stuff. And we see it here, turning stuff, inanimate things into crocodiles. Oh, come on. We do that. So the person writing the narrative has knowledge about these things, these Egyptian laws, and he is incorporating them into the Exodus narrative. So one would read it, would read the Egyptian sources and say, you see, what the Bible said happened. No, what you've done is you're reading after the fact. You've taken the Egyptian sources, which the text is written around, and you're using that to prove that, see, the Exodus was real. But no, that's not what you should do. You should rather find out how these people had access to these traditions in Egypt. So it's actually the other way around. So the whole plagues and all of that, there are sources of them in Egyptian traditions, Egyptian folklores, Egyptian myths, etc. Any questions on this here? Okay, now we come to the tabernacle. The tabernacle and the battle tent of Ramses, Ramses II. Mr. H. Barton, yes. Yes. Now, the Levite priests' detailed description of the tabernacle, which is their sacred tent of meeting, is a significant aspect of the five books of Moses. This tabernacle, it is clear if you read the Torah, it is clear that the tabernacle had immense importance to the Levites. Why do I say that? Because there is more information about the tabernacle than anything else in the five books of Moses. You can check it. Well, when you look at the tabernacle, you notice something interesting, that it shares architectural similarities with the battle tent of Pharaoh Ramses II. The size, the shape, the proportions, the surrounding courtyard, the golden winged accoutrements, the eastern orientation, and then the arrangement of outer court and inner court all match between the two structures. They all match. So this parallels suggest that the Levites may have been influenced, or should we say, borrowed from Egyptian culture in the construction of their tabernacle. If you want a good source, this is one. To your tents, O Israel, Michael Homan. He writes about this into details. So the size, the shape, proportion, the surrounding courtyard, the golden winged accoutrement, the eastern orientation, the arrangement of inner court, outer court, you see a parallel here as well. So we see Egypt's hand or Egyptian culture behind the biblical text, which is coming from those who wrote most of the text, the Levites, who I'm saying that they were the only ones in Egypt. So what can I conclude here? All 8 Israelites with Egyptian names are Levites, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago. It is noteworthy. All of this list, they are noteworthy. So all the 8 Israelites with Egyptian names are Levites. The extensive treatment of the tabernacle, which bears a striking resemblance to the Egyptian tent of Pharaoh Ramses II, is found in the Levite priestly sources. The ark, which is entrusted to the Levites, has parallels to the Egyptian barks. All 7 references to Egyptian law in the Bible are found in Levite sources. All 11 references to circumcision in legal texts, literal or metaphorical, circumcision of the flesh or heart, occur in Levitical sources in the Torah and the prophets, with 2 references in stories involving the Levite Moses or Levi himself. All 3 sources that tell the story of the plagues and Exodus are Levite sources, as are all the texts dealing with slavery during and after the Israelites' stay in Egypt. So I did not mention this one. When you take the text and the laws that surround slavery, they are all from the Levitical sources. The laws that tell you about how to treat an alien, they are all from the Levitical sources. Why will that be? Why is that important? That would be a question. Why are they concerned about slavery and how you treat the alien? What is the reason that they give? Why should we be nice to the alien? Why should we treat slaves better? Mr. Marvin says it. You were once a stranger in a foreign land because you were slaves in Egypt, because you were aliens in Egypt. So those who had experienced this kind of slavery, those who ran out of Egypt, they do have concerns about how you treat an alien, about how you treat someone as a slave. Even though it doesn't abolish it, it kind of makes it a little bearable. And this is coming from the Levitical hands. All 52 references to the sanctuary, or we call the Mikdash, in the Bible, which is where the people in the Song of the Sea go, identify it as the temple or tabernacle, the shrines accessible only to the Levites. So you see what's going on. They are the only ones who had access to that. Non-Levitical sources lack all of this information. The J source lacks all of this thing that I've just mentioned here. It doesn't deal with it. It doesn't concern the author. Why? He wasn't there. He doesn't know that much about it. His focus is something else, or her focus is something else. So this is what we have. This is my evidence from 2 weeks ago showing that It's only this group of people who were in Egypt, and it's only this group of people who left out of Egypt. And these are my texts to support that idea that we may want to consider that. And then we've looked into our text to see, do we get anything that matches the people who wrote the text, the Levite, the Shasu people who left? Did they bring any wisdom of Egypt into our text? Can we see it? Can we follow it and see who concerns themselves with this kind of information? And as we've seen, they are all coming from the Levites, who I'm saying that were the Shasu of Yahweh, who left out of Egypt, and then they came and then they attached. What's what Levi means? They attached themselves to the northern kingdom of Israel.